Good evening and Shana Tova. Today I would like to tell you the story of how my mother's toothpaste and the Arab shopkeeper saved an Israeli submarine. And trust me, it'll all make sense at the end. My mother grew up in the 1920s in the Bronx, when the Bronx was the place to live in New York. The family was very affluent. They lived in a mansion that stretched over an entire city block with a fountain in the yard and a private chauffeur in a silver Cadillac and all the comforts of life. And sometime in 1929 or 1930, the big house, as they called it, and all the money in it went the way of the stock market, and the family moved into a two-bedroom apartment in Manhattan. Later on in life, when my mother made Aliyah to Israel, she brought with her 3 items from the big house, as they called it. She brought 3 Kiddush cups, all engraved with the names of her mother, her father, and herself. And in Israel, my mother revived an old family tradition by which every person that joins the family, either by marriage or by birth, receives a Kiddush cup with his name engraved on it. Once a year, my mother held a very large party at the end of February, beginning of March, and those of you who are trying to figure out what Jewish holiday that corresponds to, they didn't listen very well to my speech last year, because it did not correspond to any Jewish holidays, because we didn't really celebrate the Jewish holidays in the kibbutz. But like everything else in the kibbutz, it was a collective thing. And because most of my family have their birthdays at the end of February or beginning of March, my mother held a collective birthday party for my entire family. And your ticket to enter my mother's birthday party was that you had to bring your Kiddush cup with you. I'm going to diverge for a few minutes and talk about life on the kibbutz, growing up. The kibbutz was founded on the pure Marxist principles that everybody contributes according to his ability and receives according to his needs. Contributes according to his ability is easier to explain. Everybody in the kibbutz had a job, from young kids to school kids, teenagers, adults, disabled people, and very abled people. Everybody worked in the kibbutz. As they say, mitzet hachama v'ad tzet neshama, which basically translates to from sunrise until you can't breathe anymore, you're so tired. Receiving according to his ability or according to his needs, that requires a little bit more explanation. The premise was that if you work hard, mitzet hachama v'ad tzet neshama, everything is provided to you free of charge. The kibbutz I grew up in, however, was not a very affluent kibbutz. So they tried to make everything they could on the kibbutz, and what they bought wasn't very good quality. With that being said, healthcare was provided, clothes were provided as long as they're all cotton and blue. Food was served in the main dining room. Dentist was working hard, and so is everybody else on the kibbutz. If you were a smoker, you were provided with those foul-tasting Noblesse cigarettes, and the entire kibbutz shampooed their hair with this shampoo that was made on the premises. What went into it, I don't know, and I don't want to know, but I can tell you that it was called egg shampoo. And everybody in the kibbutz brushed their teeth with this foul-tasting, lime green colored toothpaste with the also marketable name of pea chlorophyll, which, by the way, kept our dentist working really hard, mitzet hachama v'ad tzet neshama, because it did not do a very good job protecting our teeth. My mother, who was the most resourceful person I've ever met in my life, discovered that the best use for that pea chlorophyll toothpaste was polishing silverware. So the night before the birthday party, she assembled all of the young kids in the family and taught us how to polish silverware using pea chlorophyll toothpaste. You can't use too much because it will leave white residue in the little crevices in the silverware. And you can't use too little because, well, it's just not going to do the job, and you have to use an old cotton rag, preferably an old t-shirt. And the next day, nothing gave my mother more pleasure than setting the table with a white tablecloth, arraying all the family's Kiddush cups on it, and they were sparkling in the kibbutz sun, with the house faintly smelling of toothpaste. And I'm going to fast forward a few years to when I became 18. And when I became 18, the Israel I grew up in, everybody served and everybody was drafted, men and women. And the first stop when you join the military is an army base with also military name of Bakum. And Bakum is actually an acronym like everything else in the army. And it stands for Receiving and Distribution Base, which basically receives civilians and distributes them as soldiers to the various units. And the way that the distribution worked, it was the old names out of a hat. They pulled everybody's names into a hat, and then whatever unit needed soldiers that day, names were pulled out of a hat. And if tanks needed 20 soldiers, they pulled 20 names out of a hat, and you went to serve in the tanks, artillery, and so forth and so on. The only way to escape that sorting hat ceremony, and I cannot believe that J.K. Rowling did not think of that, was to volunteer to an elite unit. In Israel, they say that you only volunteer once, because volunteering to an elite unit guarantees you harder work, less sleep, and longer service. Now, the premise is that you get a much more interesting service. My parents, who raised all of us with the old Israeli saying, Im kvar, az kvar, which basically means if you do something, do it right. It was no wonder that I was the third of my brothers to volunteer to the Naval Academy. And after the Naval Academy, I actually volunteered a second time, this time for submarine service. And after a little bit more, or a lot more training, I ended up in one of the only submarines the Israeli Navy actually owns. And I progressed through the ranks and eventually became the second in command, also called the executive officer. The executive officer's job is to basically run the submarine, from loading armament to training sailors to helping the chef decide what to cook in tomorrow's lunch. One secret they don't tell you about submarine service is that when the submarine leaves port, all bad news ceases to exist. And headquarters does not transmit any bad news to a submarine at sea. So when you come back to port, the executive officer gets a folder which is fondly named the folder of bad news. And in it, there are all the bad news of what happened while you were at sea. This person's mother is in the hospital, and this person's brother played soccer and broke his foot, or whatever happened while you were at sea. The days were the days of the first Lebanon War, and my submarine was at sea most of the time. When we came back to port, it was under the cover of darkness, and it didn't happen very often. And one of those times we came back to port, and I received the folder of bad news, and it was not very full, surprisingly enough. And I leaf through the telegrams, and I get to the last one, and I run to find the captain. And I say, Captain, I think we have a problem. And he says, what is it? And I said, I have a telegram here. It's 3 sentences long. The first sentence is very simple. It says, tomorrow morning, 9 a.m. sharp, you will have a VIP visitor. That wasn't new. Anybody in Israel who is in power would like to take his picture with a submarine. It makes them look tough. The next 2 sentences, however, said, your visitor will be the chief rabbi of the Israeli Armed Forces. And at the end of his visit, he is going to inspect your Tashmishei Kodesh, your religious artifacts. And I say, Captain, do we even own or have on the submarine Tashmishei Kodesh? And the captain says, oh, yes, of course we do. It's in the top locker in my cabin. Now, let me pause and say, first of all, on an Israeli submarine, the only person who has his own cabin is the captain. Everybody else is hot bunking. The top locker in my captain's cabin was called behind his back Kodesh HaKodashim. And not apparently because it held the religious artifacts, but because my captain, in spite of the strict prohibition on alcohol on Navy ships, managed to convince the Israeli Navy that he must have a bottle of gin. Because, get it, gin is the best cleaning solution for cleaning the periscope's optical lens before the submarine dives. And I run to his cabin, and out of Kodesh HaKodashim, I pull not 1, but 3 bottles of gin. And behind them I find a small Sefer Torah with a yad, a Kiddush cup, and a dish for Besamim. And they look exactly the way you would think silverware looks when it was neglected for a few years in close proximity to salt water. They resembled lumps of coal that was that black. And the only thought that came to my mind was, where do I find a tube of pea chlorophyll toothpaste in Haifa at 9 p.m. in a city that goes to sleep at 8 p.m.? And I summoned to me one of the young officers, and I say, Ronen, this is your time to shine, literally. Take my car and drive to the Wadi neighborhood. That is the Arab neighborhood in Haifa. There is a store there. It is open until midnight. You look for the store owner, Abu Ali. He knows me. I shopped there many times. And tell him you're looking for the kibbutznik toothpaste. And make it quick. An hour later, Onen comes back with 2 tubes of toothpaste and says, Abu Ali says, you can have that toothpaste that you asked for, but it's not going to do anything to protect your teeth. So he's also sending you a very good tube of toothpaste. And for the rest of that night, I taught young Ronen Keller everything my mother ever taught me about polishing silverware. You can't use too much because it'll leave white residue in the small crevices. You can't use too little because it's just not going to do the job. And you have to use an old 100% rag, preferably an old t-shirt. The next morning, 9 a.m. sharp, I go down to the pier. I found the chief rabbi standing there, and I bring him down to the submarine, and I give him the royal tour from the torpedo tubes in the front to the engine room in the back, including the obligatory gaze into the submarine periscope, the optical lens of which was indeed cleaned that morning by the captain's finest gin. And he keeps on remarking on how clean the place is and how well maintained it is. And at the end of the visit, he says, well, may I inspect your religious artifacts? And we go to my captain's cabin, and out of Kodesh HaKodashim, by the way, the gin I hid in the corner ahead of time. I pull out the small Sefer Torah with a yad, a Kiddush cup, and a dish for Besamim, and they're all sparkling in the submarine neon lights. And the rabbi does what rabbis do when they inspect religious artifacts. I have no idea what he did, but at the end he straightens up and says, sailors, I always knew that submarines have to be well maintained because they protect your life, but these are some of the best maintained religious artifacts I've ever seen in the entire Israeli armed forces. And that, my friends, call for a very big l'chaim. And if my eyes don't deceive me, I see a very good bottle of gin right there in the corner. And there we stood, the rabbi with the biggest smile on his face because he just witnessed a miracle. My captain with the biggest sour look on his face because, well, for the second time that day, somebody is using his precious gin. And me, with black circles under my eyes and remnants of my mother's toothpaste under my fingernails, we did a big l'chaim, and we sent the rabbi on his merry way. So why am I telling you this story? Well, I'm telling you this story for 2 reasons. The first reason is that I believe that just like my mother had something that she did very well, every single one of you has something that they do very well and love doing. And whatever it is that you do well, we here at Becky need your help. You might be a very good builder and love to work with your hands. And if that is the case, I'm sure Roger Colton would love to have your help maintaining the sukkah outside. You might be a good lecturer or a great teacher, in which case we would love to have you either teach, give a lecture online, or even help teach our kids. You might even be a great chef or great cook and love cooking. And one day we will all be back in a building, and I am sure the Kiddush committees or the Kiddush teams would love to have your help in cooking Kiddush for us again. Whatever it is that you do and whatever it is that you like to do, we're always looking for volunteers at Becky. The second reason I'm telling you this story is because throughout my life, many people helped me and came to my aid. And I believe that every one of these people came to my help because sometime before that, I treated them with dignity and respect. I was helped by a Hindu taxi driver in Singapore. I was helped by an Arab shopkeeper in Haifa. I was helped by an Iraqi factory manager in Juarez, Mexico. I was helped by the son of a Russian oligarch in Riga, Latvia, and many, many more. And all of them came to my help for exactly that reason. And I believe that these days, when people are trying to sow divisiveness in our land, it is incumbent upon us, all of us Becky members, all of us members of society, to treat everybody, regardless of the color of their skin, their sexual orientation, their religion, their everything else that people tell you makes us different. We should all treat everybody with dignity and respect inside our community and outside and throughout the world. And on a second thought, I will add a third reason, and that is hope. When I looked at those black silverware pieces, I was hoping that I will restore them to their former glory. Today, I look out and the pews are empty and the building is empty, and I hope that I will be able to restore Becky to its former glory, and one day we will all be back here at Becky. We'll probably even have Kiddush together and Shmuz together. That is my hope. And I would like to conclude first by thanking our employees, Rabbi John Jay, who enlightens us with Torah every day, Ina Silverman, who is our Becky Religious School principal and does her best to educate our kids. I'd like to thank Peggy Hackett, who is our office manager, and as I always say, manages us more than we manage her, and make sure that everything at Becky happens when it should. I would like to thank Annie Schiff, our newest employee, who is our youth director. And I would like to thank Michael Barone, our facilities manager, for whom no job is too big or too small, and he does them all with a very big smile on his face. So once again, this year I am standing here alone, but behind me there is a huge army of volunteers, and those volunteers are the people who make Becky the wonderful place that it is for all of us, and I would like to thank every single one of our volunteers. So on behalf of the entire board, my family and myself, I would like to wish everybody Shana Tova, Gmar Chatima Tova, easy and meaningful fast, and thank you everybody.